All right, greetings everybody, and welcome to Conflict Radio. Today is December 7th, 2021. I believe it's Pearl Harbor Day today, so I guess it's really early here in the States. It's 3:30 a.m. here. I know my Australian peeps are excited, and so is my guest, Anthony Peake, because I'm up early and he's not. And Anthony Peake grew up in Wirral, near Liverpool, England. He was educated at Wirral Grammar School, Warwick University, and the London School of Economics. He is a member of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, the Scientific and Medical Network, and the Society for Psychic Research. His YouTube channel is absolutely fascinating. I suggest you get over there. You could get lost in his videos for hours and hours and hours. Anthony Peake, this is your second time on Conflict Radio. We had you way back in episode 12. We actually went live and replayed that episode earlier, and we had commentary on it with all of the people that are following this show now, and everybody agrees you're an amazing guest, you're an amazing man, an amazing brain that we're lucky enough to have in the world today. Welcome to Conflict Radio. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm just amazed that you're up so bright and early over there in the States. But here it's a little bit more civilized. It's around about 9:40, so it's quite good for me. So at least I won't fall asleep. Normally when I'm doing these shows, it's the other way around. So I'm bright and bushy-tailed.
You know, I feel pretty good. We got done. We did the earlier show. We rebroadcast it because, you know, I mean, we were a newer show then, so a lot of people didn't get to hear it. And we rebroadcast it to a bigger audience this time and had some really good feedback on it. And I went right into the bed and took a nap and woke up, and I'm ready to go. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's 3:30 to me. It's just showtime. So
it just hit you. It'll hit you later.
Yeah, when it's over with, and I'm sitting down like, oh shit, I got to go to bed. It's like 8 in the morning.
Absolutely.
All right, so I want to talk to you about your new book, Cheating the Ferryman. It's not out yet, but it's coming out, I believe, in June, right?
Correct, June the 1st, yeah.
All right, June 1st.
Both in the States and in the UK, and probably in Australia as well.
Now this idea, it fascinates me, of cheating the ferryman, because I've always had a belief in my own mind. I used to have deja vu when I was younger, and I always thought that, I'll never forget it. I remember I was sitting down and I was cutting a potato or something. I think I was 15 or 16 years old, and I literally had to put the knife down, and I was like, oh my God, I've done this before. I remember doing this exact thing. I was in this exact place doing this before. And as I've gotten older, I feel like I don't have deja vu anymore. And I think it's because I changed my past life, because I believe that and this is something I've believed in a long time, that when you die, you have an opportunity to come back and live your exact same life again. And I believe that intuition or gut feelings that you have in your gut or in your stomach are basically your memories of that past life telling you, don't go that way, or don't open that door. You've done that already, and that doesn't go well. What am I hitting the nail on the head, or what?
Michael, you've hit it so perfectly. I would suspect that if you'd got your act together and written a book on it, you'd have probably written my books for me, because that is exactly the position I take on this. Absolutely. You know, you're one of the few people that have interviewed me that have really just got it before we've even started discussing it. Because for me, I've experienced deja vu experiences, or what we could argue as deja vecu, already lived, for many years. And rather like yourself, I was rather intrigued as to discovering, as I got older, the incidence of deja vus drop off. Now, funnily enough, there's been research done on this. We all suspect that this is the case, but there has been objective academic research done on this. And there were at least 2 academic papers written on this subject. And yes, this is a consistency. It seems that the older you get, the less deja vus you experience. And of course, as you rightly observe, that could be explained simply by the fact that if you're living in an instantation or a simulation of your life, and you live your life many times, there will be, of course, a point in your life where you'll have taken a different path to the path you took last time. And of course, deja vus can't occur because it's all novel to you, it's all new to you. And therefore, there are no deja vus. But interestingly enough, in my last book, the one before that, Opening the Doors of Perception, I've done a considerable amount of research on the subject and discovered that deja vu does start again, and it starts again towards the end of your life. When you get to within a year or two of your own future demise, deja vu start again. And it's called late onset deja vu. And there's a guy called Chris Moulon of the University of Leeds over here in the UK, and his associate, Akira O'Connor, who has been doing research into this. And of course, they have no explanations for this. They just are looking at the analysis. But again, I would argue that what's taking place here is the body's getting ready, or your mind is getting ready to going back again. It's getting ready to going back to living your life again. And old memories are starting to be evoked. Because, of course, one of the most fascinating phenomena is when you get older, your memories of your early childhood start to come up again. It happened with my mother and various other people I know, where suddenly they're back remembering childhood memories that they'd long forgotten. And I think this is evidence for my concept of cheating the ferryman. Just one final point on this is that, of course, if you read most books on psychology and neurology, even in recent years, they will state that deja vu is fully understood. The deja vu isn't. At the last count, there were 72 different theories of deja vu, including my own, by the way. There was a book on deja vu written about 5 or 6 years ago by an American university professor, and he listed 72 different versions. And the one that's cited the most is something called the Efron hypothesis, which was put forward in 1962 by a guy called Robert Efron. And basically, it's called the visual pathways hypothesis. And the idea is that, in simple terms, your non-dominant hemisphere processes the image of the external world a split second before your dominant hemisphere does. And you get the feeling that you've experienced it twice. But of course, anybody out there, and you probably, Michael, yourself know that when you have a deja vu experience, it's far more profound than that.
Yeah.
It's the overall sensation, is you have, and as the definition of it is the literal definition of a deja vu sensation, and I never get it fully right, but it is a remembering of something that you're experiencing now that you have experienced at some undefined time in your past. Because that's the whole point, isn't it? It's undefined. You don't know when. You just sense it.
Yeah, it's a weird feeling. It really is, like when it really does happen, because like you're right. You literally you get it. You get it right away. Like, oh my God, I'm doing this again. Why am I doing this again? And I'm trying to think of, well, maybe I was doing this again, like, or doing this before or something. And I'm like, no, like this, I'm completely doing this for the first time, but yet I'm doing it again. It was one of the weirdest things.
And you have that feeling, don't you? There's a kind of a shiver that goes down your spine. There's this kind of weird otherworldliness about it, which is so difficult to define. And the sensation is, wow, this is just so strange. Now, the Efron hypothesis, if it was valid, it would be about 0.5 of a second delay. But it's the overall sensation. It's everything about the feeling that you're having and everything else. Now, there's an associate of mine, Dr. Arthur Funkhauser, who is a quantum physicist by training, by the way. He's an expert in holograms, but he's also a Jungian analyst. He's an American, but he lives in Switzerland. And he has a fascinating take on this, and he calls it the dream theory of deja vu. And this is that you have recently had a precognitive dream. And in the dream, you've dreamt the events you are now living. And of course, this would explain it, because sometimes don't you get this? Sometimes you have a dream and you forget it. You forget the dream, and then suddenly something will happen during your day or a few days later, which will stimulate the memory of the dream.
Oh, yeah.
And art argues that this is what's happening. Now, I've discussed this with Art on many occasions. And again, Art is somebody I've interviewed a couple of times on my own podcast. And Art and I agree that the problem here is that you're then explaining something by something else that's inexplicable, because you have to then explain how it is that you can have precognitive dreams, don't you? Because modern science doesn't agree that precognition is possible. I have various hypotheses as to how it can be possible, but if how can you have a dream of an event that is yet to take place?
Yeah.
Now, but clearly we do. Clearly we do. Precognitive dreaming is common. It's known.
Let me ask you this, Anthony, because this is what curiates me, or I guess it's curious to me about this entire theory. And I mean, I guess it's a theory, right? I mean,
a hypothesis.
Yeah.
Even people would argue it's a hypothesis at best, cheating the ferryman, possibly even just speculation. And
but
I'm quite happy to accept that.
It's funny because it falls in line with exactly what I think is going on, me personally. Now when we come back and we I die and I come back and I'm starting my life over, am I actually starting my life over in the same time or life that my parents are having? And what I'm trying to get at is it possible that if it's my 50th life, is it also my parents' 50th life, meaning that they're changing things as well, therefore my existence will be different? Or is it only my existence that is being repeated?
That's a very, very good question, an excellent question, and clearly very well thought through. That is one of the interesting aspects of cheating the ferryman as a model. And in my previous book, sometimes in terms of my work, you have to read my previous work in order to understand where I'm going with the new work, because I argue that not only that, going back to the quantum physics, I suppose, and again, people who read my work know that I really do the quantum physics. I don't just drop the word quantum in because it's strange and it's weird. I go back to things such as the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and Pauli exclusion principle and various other ideas within quantum mechanics. But one of the and this is fascinating, there is something called entanglement. And it is an effect whereby if you put two subatomic particles in the same quantum state and then you separate them, they act as one particle, they act as a single particle. Now, when the singularity of the Big Bang 13.4 billion years ago, everything was a single object. It was entangled. And everything that's come out of the Big Bang and has been expanding outwards for the 13.8 billion years or whatever it is, are still in some form of communication, which means that everything is related to everything else, which means that every molecule of your body is related to every other molecule, but every other molecule of your parents' bodies, a sandstorm on a planet going around Alpha Centauri, they're all linked in one way or another. And indeed, a few years ago, I chatted with a very famous British quantum cosmologist and physicist called Jeff Forshaw, who's professor of quantum physics at Manchester University. And Jeff turned around to me over coffee and said, of course, we know that every electron in the universe knows the location of every other electron. Now, this again is serious science. This is not crazy. So it means that when we have this feeling of individuality, that we are us, we are my ego, that's not what science is telling us. Science is telling us that we are everything and everything is us. So suddenly the concept of our parents and our grandparents and everybody else that we, including you and I and everybody listening to this, we are much more deeply related at a deeper level of reality. Now, this is again what the Buddhists believe. It's what Ayurveda Vedanta believes. So these are beliefs that go back right into history. So it's nothing new. I'm not saying anything new here, but what I'm doing is the science of it. But then we have a very interesting idea, and it came out in a paper written around about 6 or 7 months before he died by the British quantum physicist Stephen Hawking. And he wrote a paper with a guy called Thomas Hertog, who is a Dutch researcher at CERN. And they came up with something, it's a variation on Everett's many worlds interpretation, and it was something called the top-down hypothesis of quantum physics. And get this, they believed, and they suggested in the paper that from the very billionth, trillionth of a second, or the femtosecond from the Big Bang, every event that could possibly happen from every outcome of every decision and every subatomic interaction is already encoded in the universe. It already exists out there. And what brings about a particular timeline or another is effectively our choices that we make. physiologically. So in other words, you and I are making choices all the time. I can choose to say certain words now. I could choose to make others say other words, but that already exists as a potentiality. But then if we look at our analysis of living our lives again, it means that your life could be a million lives and a million different lives, because every decision that's been made by your ancestors have all affected and created an outcome that has potentiality. So, for instance, your parents could have decided to emigrate to Australia. I mean, my parents, for instance, were planning to emigrate to Tasmania just before I was born, but my grandmother was ill. But there will be a reality that I will have been brought up in Tasmania, and that exists. In some reality, that exists. And it means that everybody is making decisions all the time, but we live within our own created universe. There's something in quantum physics called the collapse of the wave function. And to put it in simple terms, it means that every subatomic particle that comes into existence, before it is observed by a consciousness, your consciousness or mine, it is literally a statistical wave. It doesn't exist in reality. It is non-physical and it doesn't exist. All it has is the statistical potentiality of being in one location or another. The minute you observe or measure that subatomic particle, it brings it into existence, which means there's a direct relationship between us and the observer and the external world you experience, if that makes sense. So it is far more complex. And I believe that what we're existing within is what I call an instantation. I'm using the term used by a guy called Dr. Andrew Gallimore, who's a neuroscientist, British neuroscientist who lives in Japan. And he's written a fascinating book on this, and he links this to DMT and everything else. But the argument in instantation is like a simulation, but it's more subtle than that, because a simulation suggests that it's simulated from something else. It's a copy of something else. It's more intriguing than that. We all exist within our own worldview, but we also interact with other people, if that makes sense. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, it sounds to me like what you're saying is that we could probably live a billion lives and every single one of them be different just based on the people's changes around us.
Correct, because effectively, we know, as was famously said, no man is an island. And everything we do is affected by the decisions of other people. Your wife might have decided not to marry you. She might have gone off with the other guy that she was going out with when you met her, or whatever. And these my tiny decisions. But of course, as somebody said to me recently, it gets even more intriguing than this, because when you were born, your embryo, your zygote, when it was first brought together between your mother's egg and your father's sperm, there are literally hundreds of millions of sperm, and each sperm carries a slightly different message, DNA message. So depending on what sperm managed to cause you and make your mother's egg start to split, it could, again, there's so many chances involved there. So you could be a myriad of other people. And the same goes for the eggs, because your mother's egg, once a month, it changes. So, it was a myriad chance that
but if it's a different sperm, then technically it wouldn't be you, right? I mean,
well, do
you think it'd be you, or is that the part where our souls would become different, or is our soul coming into or is our consciousness coming into this? Our consciousness is coming into the egg. We just don't know. Like it's the same consciousness inside every sperm.
Well, this is exactly it. I mean, in my previous books, like The Infinite Minefield, I'm fascinated by the idea that there's a consciousness field and that consciousness is prime, that everything we perceive around us, in fact, is a brain-generated or something generated holographic illusion. Not an illusion, it's, as I say, it's more of an instantation. But what is consciousness? And of course, in my previous books, I discuss this in great detail, because nobody knows. It's called a hard problem of science, the idea of how inanimate matter in my brain, how is it that chemicals reacting with electricity in my brain create me, create my thoughts, my feelings, my dreams, my hopes. Because when it comes down to reducing it, all they are atoms reacting in fields, electromagnetic fields. and yet it creates you. So clearly there is some kind of magic trick going on whereby when these things come together in a particular configuration, this is what modern science will argue, that when everything in the brain comes together in a particular configuration, suddenly, spontaneously, and from nowhere, life comes about and consciousness comes about. But they're not even at first stage as to knowing how that process occurs, because atoms and fields are not consciousness. They're very different things. You know, consciousness is non-physical. They argue that it is an epiphenomenon of brain behaviors, but they don't know the process by which it happens. Now, this is a huge mystery. And in the mid-1990s, a young Australian philosopher called David Chalmers stood up at the University of Arizona and said that modern science has two challenges. It has the easy problem, which is understanding how the brain works, you know, how neurochemicals work, how neurotransmitters work. And then there's the hard problem, which is the thing I just said as to how consciousness comes about. But if consciousness is prime, if everything is a projection of consciousness, that solves the problem. In other words, all my brain is doing, it is acting as a receiver of the consciousness field. And it is receiving the information like a radio picks up a radio signal. So my feeling that I'm embodied in a meat machine is purely and simply because that's the illusion that takes place, because I'm looking out of my eyes and I'm hearing things through my ears, which makes me have the sense that I'm located, you know, 4 or 5 inches behind my eyes. But if we had eyes on our kneecap, we'd feel that we were located in our kneecap. And this would then explain, if consciousness is outside of the body, it can explain many things. But quantum physics is moving into that direction now anyway. You know, non-locality is telling us that there's something deeper. And this something deeper, modern science is discovering, they even have a term for it, they call it the quantum vacuum. And the quantum vacuum is this huge energy field that exists where there shouldn't be any energy. It's also called the zero-point field. And I believe that's where the encoding of the universe, because I believe that ultimately everything we perceive is mathematical. Everything we receive is digital. Our consciousness even is digital. We are digital receivers. And consciousness is a processor whereby it brings into reality digital information and projects it outwards. And we're all doing this all the time. And each of us is doing this, and every consciousness is doing this. And above all those consciousness, this is where it gets intriguing, is that above each consciousness, I argue that within each of us, the everyday consciousness that's living this life linearly, I call the eidolon. You know, the person that just lives the life from life to death and doesn't remember any of their previous lives and lives within the simulation is an eidolon. But there is an element of us which I call the daemon, which is universal. The daemon is your game player. The daemon is that bit of you that remembers you've lived this life before. And it is your guide. It is the voice you hear. It is the instincts you have. Even some people would argue it's your guardian angel. And this is a known phenomenon. It has been discussed for millennia. The word daemon is actually from the Greek.
Or spirit guide even, right?
Or spirit guide, yeah. And it guides you, rather like a game player guides an on-screen sprite when playing a computer game. You know, like Lara Croft, you know, she runs down a corridor, monster comes out and he kills her. That she is then dead. Her eidolon is dead. But the daemon is the game player, and the daemon recreates her again, has her reborn, and a new eidolon starts. And she runs down the corridor, and for some reason she feels she shouldn't run into that room, and she doesn't. So she's allowed to go a bit further into the instantation. And of course, then the daemon gleans more information about the environment she's within, which means that next time round, it is more willing and able to protect its eidolon, to help it get it through the dangers of life. I'm in the new book, I then argue that there is more levels to this. And I argue that above the daemon is something I call the uber daemon, which is the collective unconscious of humanity, of all of us. It's a singular consciousness that we are all individuated from.
The creator, so to speak.
Almost, because then I say above that is then the go daemon, which is effectively everything that there is. Within the Kabbalah, they have a concept called the Or Ein Sof, and within Vedanta, they have the idea of Brahman. And in most religions, they have this idea of this God beyond God, this whatever the intelligence is, and we are all emanations of that, and we all emanate then into the Uber Daemon, which is Jung's collective unconscious, and then there's the Daemon, which is your own personal tutelary spirit.
Yeah.
Then there is you as the Eidolon. Again, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Let me ask you real quick if you could explain to people why the title "Cheating the Ferryman." What do you mean by ferryman? I mean, I know, but other people I'm sure don't.
It's the ancient Greek. The ancient Greeks used to believe that when somebody died, you'd need to place 2 small coins over the eyes. These coins were called oboli. Sometimes they placed them over the eye of the corpse, and sometimes they placed them underneath the tongue of the corpse. And the reason they did this was they believed that when the person died, they became a shade, which is like a disembodied spirit. And this disembodied spirit would find itself on the banks of a huge river. And out of the mists of the river would come Charon, the boatman. And Charon would offer to ferry the dead person across the river Styx to the land of the dead. But to do so, he would need to be paid. And this is where the oboli come in. So the shade would pay the oboli, and Charon would take the person over to the land of the dead. Okay. Now, when the person got to the land of the dead, and this is most people know about the idea of crossing the river Styx, but there is more to Greek philosophy than this, because the Greeks believed that when you got to the land of the dead, you then had the choice of drinking. The river Styx has many tributaries. There's the Acheron, and there's the Lethe, and various other rivers in the underworld. Of course, this is all an analogy, but nevertheless, this is the principle. You were given the choice of going back and living your life again. But if you chose to do so, you'd have to drink the waters of the river Lethe, Lethe, and the river Lethe was the river of forgetting. What it would do is you drink the waters and you would forget everything about your previous life. You would forget everything. Then you'd be allowed to go back and you'd been reborn. And the Stoics believed you'd be reborn as yourself and live your life again. But this time round, you completely have forgotten what you were and who you were. You were in a state of what the Greeks called amnesis. Now, occasionally in our lives, then we get into a state of anamnesis, which is remembering. And sometimes we then remember that we're living our lives again. And this is, again, a guy called Peter Ouspensky, who was a Russian philosopher, who had a very similar hypothesis to my own. He didn't do the science as I do, but he had a similar hypothesis. And he argued that occasionally anamnesis takes place and we realize we're living our lives again. And that's sometimes what happens with deja vu, I think. But what I argue is at the point of death, when we're dying, there's a group of chemicals are released within the brain. And these chemicals do certain things. There is something called the Moody traits, which are related to near-death experiences. And Raymond Moody and also a guy called Grayson have worked on something called the scales, the NDE scales, and they have these different things that people describe when they had an NDE experience. All of these fit into my cheating the ferryman hypothesis, because what happens is people think that time dilates, that they have past life memories, they have a panoramic life review, they go through a tunnel, all these things. Now, what these are taking place, these are chemicals being released in the brain.
It's
now,
DMT, right?
Pardon?
DMT, right?
Oh, well, we can just go off on a tangent. Yes, exactly. I argue in my book, The Infinite Minefield, that it's exactly DMT. And again, remind me when I finish this to then go on to the DMT hypothesis and how DMT creates this. But the chemicals are released. So for argument's sake, DMT is released, dimethyltryptamine is released, or 5-MeO-DMT possibly is released within the brain. And this then slows down your awareness of time. Now imagine a scenario that suddenly you're in a car crash, and just before the impact takes place, these chemicals are released in your brain. And the next millisecond in your life is 10 seconds. And then the next millisecond within that is another 10 seconds or 50 seconds or a year. You suddenly realize very quickly that you're already existing in ever smaller bits of time. So you have all the time in the world to live your life again, before you die. This is so important. I argue in Cheating the Ferryman, we never reach the point of death because we're living in ever smaller bits of our own subjective time. Now, time and time again, people will tell you, I fell off a mountain, and as I was falling, two things happened. Time slowed down for me, and I suddenly had past life memories welling up. I was back being a child. I was running across a field as a child, and then I remembered all the things in my life. Other people say they lived their whole life in that few seconds, and I believe this is what takes place. So you live a whole life, and at the end of that next life, in an even smaller bit of time, you live another life. It's called Zeno's bisection paradox. It's, again, a mathematical structure whereby if you split things into halves all the time, every inch, the next inch is 2 inches, and you split into two, you will never get to a particular point in time. And this is how you treat the ferryman. You never get to the banks of the Styx because you never die. And this is such an important point about my hypothesis. And this is why I was very upset when I wasn't recognized in the recent Bigelow Prize, which you probably heard about. You know, people were asked to write essays on survival after death. My essay got through shortlisting, but it didn't get any of the prizes. And I'm very, very upset about this because I think this hypothesis is by far the most powerful explanation of immortality anywhere in the world, written by anybody, because none of the other winners do the science. I'm the only one that wrote an essay that did science, hard science. So you never get to your death. Now, if you never get to the point of death, it means that your brain is still functioning. So I don't need to say that you go out your body and you go to heaven and you do all these other things as a kind of a ghost. I don't need to do that because it's all happening in your brain while it's still alive. You know, so all the processing that the brain does that allows the consciousness field to get into the brain continues. Okay. But what we do is we move into different universes, different worlds. And again, so going back to the DMT thing, and it was a point you made earlier on, which I thought was a really interesting one, was at what point does consciousness come into the embryo? This is so important because according to the ancient beliefs of the Buddhists, it happens at the 49th day of gestation. So up until 49 days, the embryo has no soul. It has no consciousness within it of any sort. But at the 49th day, it suddenly becomes a being that has an inner consciousness. Now, the interesting thing about this, and this is extraordinary, at the 49th day of gestation, in the embryo, something very peculiar happens. At that time, there is a double gland at the back of the throat called the epiphysis. And the epiphysis, after the 49th day of gestation, moves from the back of the throat up into the middle of the brain. It then splits into two glands, the pineal gland and the pituitary gland. This leaves a very little pouch or a cleft that runs down from the pineal gland to the back of the throat. It's called Rathke's cleft. Mm-hmm. Now, I believe what happens is that the pineal gland, as you know, is one of the few things in the brain that's not double. You know, there's two hippocampi, there's two amygdalae, there's all of them. But it's a single unit that sits in the center of the brain. It exists there. It takes more blood. More of your blood is used around your pineal gland. The only other organ that has more blood activity around it is the liver. So there's something very strange about the pineal gland, considering how tiny it is. And what it does is it creates a substance called melatonin. And melatonin is the substance that makes you go to sleep. Okay. Now, I've been doing the neurochemistry and chemistry with associates of mine are doing research into DMT, dimethyltryptamine. Melatonin and dimethyltryptamine are very similar structured molecules. You can synthesize from melatonin and you can change melatonin into DMT, which means that DMT could be a neurotransmitter within the brain. Now, for long periods of time, Rick Strassman wrote a book many years ago called The Spirit Molecule, and he argued that DMT was our reality modulator. It is DMT that creates the world outside of us from our brains. Okay. Now, what is more intriguing here is that could it be that DMT is created by the pineal gland, but because we can never test it, because you can never break open somebody's head, cut into their pineal gland to see if there's DMT in there. Never been able to do it because you'd kill the person. You couldn't do it. But in 2017, a researcher called Jimo Borjigin at the University of Michigan and a group of researchers found DMT in the brain of live rats. So when people turn around and say that DMT has not been found in the brain, it has. It was discovered. So clearly DMT is excreted by the pineal gland. It is created by the pineal gland. There could be no other reason why DMT was in these rats' brains. But, and this gets really fascinating and is massive support of my theory, and why the hell the guys at Bix didn't pick up on this, it drives me crazy. It annoys me so much. The Bix essay,
the same reason why the Smithsonian won't admit that there's giant skeletons found all over the world. I mean,
yeah, it could be. Well, these guys wanted to prove life after death. The Bix competition was to prove life after death, but they had essays on I talk to my dead children, and I've read the essays. A lot of them are complete crap, and they got prizes of between $20,000. The winner got $500,000. And not one of the essays on that competition does anything like my essay discusses. But let's go back to this thing about.
Let me interrupt you for just a second there. $500,000. I'm sure whoever won it, it was picked long before they ever wrote their essay.
It's obvious. The person that he's a friend of the people who run the competition.
Yeah, that's the way that stuff works.
A guy called Jeffrey Mishlove. And I've read Jeffrey Mishlove's winning essay. Do you know Jeffrey Mishlove's winning essay? And I'll say this now on live radio. Read Jeffrey Mishlove's winning essay of the Bix competition for $500,000. Then read the book I wrote with a guy called Irvin Laszlo 9 years ago on the subject of life after death. The bloody book I wrote 9 years ago contains everything that's in Mishlove's bloody essay. But that's an aside. I'm getting annoyed here and I shouldn't. But going back then, because the final point of this, and this is so profoundly important, the researchers at the University of Michigan found something else about live rats. They killed some rats under laboratory conditions humanely. And they found about 6 or 7 seconds after the rat had died, there was a huge amount of brain activity. Suddenly just burst, and the brain suddenly started firing all over the brain. That's my cheating the ferryman happening. That is actual neurological evidence, because that rat was having a past life review. That's what the brain activity was happening in the rat's brain. I have proof. I'm standing here with these guys and I'm going, for God's sake, here I have absolute proof from peer-reviewed academic papers. And people are willing to win $20,000 because they're turning around and saying, my son was a reincarnation of an American World War II pilot. And I'm going, that's not proof, that's anecdote.
This is fascinating, and it's a shame we only have you, I guess, for another 40, 50 minutes or so. Let me ask you this, because it's so interesting what you said about. We could be on our, about how when our first person is dying, that last 10 seconds of us dying could be our brain pretty much imagining thousands and thousands of different lives, right? That's fascinating.
Well, it's the idea, isn't it, that, when you load, particularly the modern day, I have an Oculus headset, virtual reality headset, and you put an Oculus headset on. Can you imagine a scenario of a virtual reality recreation program of your life? And imagine, and again, in one of my books, I say this, imagine a scenario that somebody can create a feedback suit that you get inside. So there's a suit and you put it on and it's got sensors all over your body. So every movement you make is reproduced within the virtual reality environment you find yourself in.
Well,
put the headset, pardon?
Yeah, no, go ahead. Finish your thought.
And then you put the headset on and you're enclosed within the suit. okay? And then you're in this environment that is a recreation of your life and incidents in your life. But then, as I said earlier on, you suffer, you drink the waters of the Lethe, and you forget that you're in a game. You could not know that there would be no way you could tell that that the reality you were perceiving was a simulation. You could not know. And again, there was a very famous essay written a few years ago.
Would it be a simulation then? If this isn't my first life and this is just my brain imagining my life different, that means that you wouldn't even be real. The voice that I'm listening to in my headphones right now is basically just my memory of a conversation we once had, right?
When years ago in 2004, 2005, when I wrote my first book, Is There Life After Death, that was the position I took, was that the mystery of other minds, how it's called solipsism. The idea, if all I can ever know is what I'm experiencing, how can I accommodate other lives and other beings? And this is where my daemon and uber daemon come in. If we are one single consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, which Bill Hicks has argued, and the Vedantists argue, and everybody else, you and me are the same thing. You and I are the same entity. You and I and everybody else listening to this program are the same being. So in which case there is no other people, because we are the other people. So in which case my part of the simulation and your part of the simulation are overlapping at the moment. There is this overlap of what I call our phanerons. It's a guy called Charles Stewart Peirce come up with this idea of the phaneron, which is the universe that is created from your sensory experiences. Again, in the book, again, a lot of people will be thinking, what's this guy talking about? Believe me, in the book, I go into the philosophy. I go into the science. I mean, really drill in. I quote people like Louis-Auguste Blanqui and Walter Benjamin and Peter Ouspensky and Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger. These are serious philosophers. But I then leaven that in with the science. And I pull the science in and I say, okay, it's all well and good being a philosopher, but that's just doesn't, where's the science? And I then bring the science in as well. And I just feel sometimes that it's such a huge idea. And it's so massive and its implications are extraordinary. And this is why when people come across my work, sometimes people over the years, they've gone to my talks, and it's only when they've gone to about 3 or 4 talks and they'll come up to me and they'll go, oh my God, I just realized what you're saying. Because you need to think slightly differently about what it is to be human, what it is, how you are perceiving the world around you. I mean, for instance, people who believe that the external world is as it seems, as it's presented to you by your senses, are called naive realists. It's not like that. The external world is not like that. Modern researchers now, people like Vlatko Vedrell, professor of quantum physics at the University of Singapore, wrote a book a few years ago, arguing that everything is just digital information. And indeed, a recent book, Our Mathematical Universe, by Professor Max Tegmark, similarly argues that what we perceive to be reality is in fact mathematical in its structure. And not only this, but Max Tegmark, and this again you will find intriguing, and by all means, guys, if you're listening out there, do check this out, because it's not just me making this up. If you go online and go onto YouTube and do a search on the quantum suicide experiment, this was a thought experiment put forward by Max Tegmark. Now, Max Tegmark is probably one of the top 5 physicists in the world at the moment. He really is an amazing guy. And he had an experience when he was a child, when he was a schoolboy, and it's in the book, by the way, it's in the new book, this, when he was cycling to school. And he was cycling, and he came to a T-junction in the center of Stockholm, because he was when he was living in Sweden. And he suddenly slammed his brakes on. And he stopped the brakes, and the brakes stopped him at a T-junction, just as a juggernaut truck came past. And he realized that had he not slammed his brakes on, he would have been killed. And it's then when a little light went on in his head and he thought, but I could have been killed. All that happened was chemicals in my brain suddenly made a decision, in which case there will be a universe that I was killed. And then he thinks, no, according to quantum physics, I can never die. And he uses a variation on Schrodinger's cat experiment. It's fascinating. And again, it is so supportive, yet again, of my cheating the ferryman hypothesis. This is, I have so much support from this, from people who don't even know I exist. So check it out. It's fascinating.
It is. And let me tell you something. You're one of the most fascinating people that I think I've ever talked to in my life. I just want to let everybody know that we're 47 minutes into the show right now, and I've only gotten to the very first question in my note page here, and I have 3 pages of questions.
Oh, I'm sorry, Michael.
We're gonna have to get you back on again here pretty soon because my mind is blown. Let me ask you this, okay? We talked a little bit about DMT, okay? I want to talk about the machine elves a little bit. And I think you said before that they're part of our subconscious, that we create them. Now, do we actually create them with our mind? Are they independent beings that we created with our mind?
This is, again, if anybody has the opportunity, if you read my books one after the other, you think this is blowing your mind when you actually read the other books as well. In my previous book, the Hidden Universe, this is exactly what I'm suggesting, is that the machine elves, the entities that people experience. And funnily enough, if you guys are really interested here, and Michael, you might be very much interested in doing this. Yesterday, I did an interview with a guy called Steve Merritt, who is a parapsychological researcher. And this is directly related to the things we're talking about now. Some of the experiments he's been doing under controlled conditions with entities are extraordinary. Literally, it was put up yesterday evening on my YouTube channel. Watch it; it'll blow your mind. Okay. But just going back, remember I argued that we seem to project outwards the reality around us. Mm-hmm. And I have a concept I call the Aggregorial. And the Egregorial are mind-created entities that we collectively create, but then become independent of us. Okay, and again, in the book, The Hidden Universe, I do the science of this. And I argue that these entities create themselves from our anticipations using plasma. Okay, and they are plasma beings. Now, again, if you look through history, there's been so many legends of people that bring into existence beings, from the tulpas, which you have in the Bon tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, but going forward into Enochian magic and the magic of people like Edmund Kelly and Dr. John Dee, and then carrying forward to people like Aleister Crowley. And even to people like Jack, I can't think of his name now, famous chaos magician, who was also a rocket scientist. Can't remember his name, it was Jack somebody, or was an American guy. But all through history, these people have been able to, by the power of thought and anticipation, create beings that become almost their servants. And that's what they're trying to do. They call them servitors. And the idea that you can create these entities and bring them forward. But when they're brought forward, they then seem to become independent of us. Now, I argue that these beings need us to become into existence within this reality, but they have existence in another reality. And they need us to think about them strongly for them to manifest. Now, I'll give an example of this, and it's a very basic example. If anybody's ever played Ouija, and the movement, when you put fingers on a glass and there's a group of you and you have a group of letters and it moves. Now, a group of people in 1971 in Toronto were fascinated by Ouija, and they thought, who is doing the pushing? Are we doing it subliminally or not? So what they decided to do was to test this, and they decided to create a ghost. This is really intriguing. They decided to create a ghost collectively. And what they did, one of them went away and she wrote a story about a young nobleman in the 1670s in England called Aylesford, I think Robert Aylesford. And Aylesford was a part of the gentry. She placed him in an actual castle that exists in Warwickshire. And she gave him a backstory. She said that he was a Catholic noble, therefore at that time, after the English Civil War, he was in a lot of stress because it was Catholicism, but also he was in a loveless marriage. And he meets a gypsy woman one day, falls in love with her, and his wife finds out and he commits suicide. They then created and thought about this guy continually. It started to manifest. It started to manifest not only in Ouija, it started to manifest with raps and knocks that took place on a table. They had other manifestations take place, and then the table started to move, and it started to levitate. And it was Philip who was doing the levitation. Now, this sounds extraordinary, but believe it, it's even more extraordinary because they were on a TV program in Toronto around about 1972, when in a live TV program, the table levitated in the studio with the raps and the knocks. Now, their argument is that they created that being, but it became independent of them. Now, it seems that these entities have come through, and there's a very famous book called The Hungry Ghosts, written by a guy called Joe Fisher, whereby mediums were talking to him about his past lives, not his past lives as in cheating the ferryman, but past lives as other people. And one of the entities that came through from the medium explained that she was a Greek woman that lived in the 17th century. They'd been lovers, and this was the name of the village where they lived. So he took himself off to Greece to find that she never existed. It was whatever it was doing, it was something that was manipulating him to believe in it. Now, our work at the moment, and this is the area I'm heavily researching in at the moment with a group of other researchers, that we believe that we can create these entities. And they're called, as I said, they're called tulpas, they're mind thought forms, but they're dangerous. And they can be. And Steve was saying this yesterday, just how dangerous these entities can be. In terms of what they can do. And they seem independent of us. Steve's doing research on the Skoll experiment that took place in the UK. In the interview, I discussed the thing called Imperator and Rector, which were a group of beings that seemed to want to communicate from somewhere else. And of course, this spins off then into UFOs, greys, alien entities, poltergeists. And this all spins off from Cheating the Ferryman. This can all be included within Cheating the Ferryman. So my overall model is an uber hypothesis of virtually every single extraordinary event. We were even discussing cryptids yesterday. We were discussing Yeti. We were discussing the abominable snowman. We were discussing how these cryptids seem to be brought into existence by people's anticipations. This is powerful stuff.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. It's amazing to think that a thought form created by us collectively that can actually move on from us. What would be the best way to talk to these thought forms?
Well, this is it. This is what they did. They created the thought form and then communicated with it. And myself and two researchers are planning to recreate the Philip experiment under controlled conditions. And our idea is to probably get one group of people located in one part of the world to actually create the thought form, and then have another group of people to receive the thought form, even though they don't know what the thought form is going to be, if that makes sense. So it's a kind of a double bind test. We'll have one group of people who will think strongly to bring this thing into existence. Then it will then contact other people. Now, again, Steve was saying some of the incredible experiments he was involved in. You must listen to this interview. It is absolutely mind-blowing. They're even discussing, they hear voices. These things speak to us. We also believe that they're like psychic vampires. They seem to feed off our fear. The fear and us giving off fear endorphins in the body seems to give them strength. And this is why they make us paint in fears. As Steve said in the interview, he said the amount of times there have been evidence of monsters that have chased people, and you're terrified and you're running away from them. But on occasions, people have turned and faced these beings, and they've come to them and gone, "Rrr!" and then stood there and not know what to do.
Well, that's getting into kind of the David Icke or Ike theory, right? I don't know. Is it Icke or Ike? I haven't talked to him, so I don't know.
Sorry, I don't even want to talk about him. Sorry.
Okay. No, that's all right. But I mean, it's kind of the same thing, right? Like if we can only think positively and try to be as positive as possible, these beings will eventually go away from us.
Oh yeah,
they're not getting anything from us.
For instance, one of the points that I think is really intriguing here is that, I was talking before about the way the act of observation brings subatomic particles into existence. The largest particles that they've now found have this wave particle duality that is directly related to the act of observation by a conscious mind. Initially, they were just photons, then they became electrons, then they became large molecules, like, for instance, a buckyball, which is a molecule of 60 separate atoms, was found to, if it was not observed, was a wave, and when it was observed, it became a particle. Now, that's a big atom, that's a big molecule, but they've got even bigger molecules now. And in one of my previous books, I argue, I think it might be in the latest book actually, I argue that the size of the largest particles they have at the moment is about 40% the size of a virus. And at the moment, they still don't know how big in size these objects that are brought into existence by the act of observation can be. But it's reasonable to conclude they could be the size of viruses. In which case, if viruses are created by our anticipation of them, suddenly we have a whole different thing about COVID. We have a whole different viewpoint here, because suddenly these things are being created by our collective anticipations of what they are going to be. I call this the Aggregorial hypothesis of science. For instance, I have cases, at least 10 cases, of quantum physicists who have thought jokingly about a particular subatomic particle in a particular configuration, and they've discovered it. It's as if we think of things and they come into existence. This is extraordinary. This means that the relationship between mind and matter is far more complex than ever anybody has ever realized. And sometimes I get so excited about my ideas. And again, I know it sounds like I'm being silly here.
No, I get excited about your ideas too, because it falls right in line with what I've been thinking my whole life.
Well, this is what I do. I feel like I feel that all these people who are coming up with these stupid ideas and everything else, and they're throwing around, they're giving each other prizes and patting themselves on their back and giving themselves PhDs on it. And I'm outside banging on the window, going, listen to what I'm saying. Please just read my books and listen. And they ignore them. They absolutely ignore them. Joe Rogan is a classic example. Do you know my Daemon theory has been discussed at least twice, maybe 3 times on the Joe Rogan show? Does he want to know? Of course he bloody doesn't. You know, it's the same with Jeffrey Mishlove. It's the same with a lot of these top people. They know of my work, but they completely pretend it does not exist. And they pretend it doesn't exist because I've joined all the dots. I've done it. There are people writing books now. I mean, people go on about, there's a guy called Lanza who wrote a book called Biocentrism in about 2009. People were nominating him for the Nobel Prize for this. They thought it was the most brilliant book that had ever been written. Read Biocentrism from 2009, then read my first book, Is There Life After Death, in 2006. I do everything, absolutely everything that Lanza does in his totally original, mind-blowing book, and much more. But my book languishes in comparative, you know, people know about it through shows like this, but it's never broken through. I can't break through the glass ceiling. And I genuinely believe that the Biggs Prize, I thought, this is the one. This is where I'm going to break through. This is where people are going to pick up what I'm doing. Didn't want to know.
It's like control perception, you control reality, right?
Yeah. And to an extent, and it could be, the things I'm saying here are so revolutionary. So revolutionary. I mean, you mentioned David Icke earlier on. In terms of what Icke's writing, I mean, David was in contact with me about 9 or 10 years ago. And he said, we must work together sometime. But I'm always wary of people like David Icke because of some of the things he says. But a lot of the stuff he's saying is similar to mine. But the difference is between myself and David Icke are two things. I do the science. If you go through my books, everything I've said here will be referenced back to academic articles. Okay? And I reference other people's work. I acknowledge other people's work. I'm happy to point out what other people have written. People like David Icke and a lot of these other guys, the David Wilcock of this world, they just want it for themselves. They don't want to share. They don't, they're making too much money to share these ideas. I don't care about the money. The money is immaterial to me. It's the ideas and getting them out there.
Yeah.
I don't care.
Just think how the world would be different if everybody, I don't know, would think the same thoughts, right? Or get it. Like if everybody got it, Well,
that's it, isn't it? Because if everybody gets it, the world could change.
Yeah.
Because it would mean that we could create a complete egregorial thought form. We could change our society by working together and thinking together on this in one way or another.
Well, that's kind of the idea of the Great Awakening, right?
Yes. Yeah. And again, you'll find that people who are involved in my work are absolutely enthusiastic. It is extraordinary how much support I get from people around the world when they come into this. They don't get involved in my work and think, oh, that's interesting. It's life-changing. And, and it is. It's life-changing for people. And it's because I'm nobody special. I'm not. I stand on the shoulders of other researchers and other writers. All I'm doing is I'm joining the dots. I'm bringing it together, pulling it together, and coming to some conclusions. Now, again, if my conclusions don't make sense or there's anything in my science that doesn't make sense, I'm the first person to say, okay, fine, I'll change it. I really genuinely, people turn around and say, oh, Anthony Peake changes his ideas sometimes. Well, yes, I do, because I gain more information. A quantum physicist will contact me or a neurologist and say, do you know that there's this new thing that's just been discovered in the brain? So I'll change it,
Yeah.
Whereas other people,
that's the process called learning.
Yeah, it is.
I think that's funny when people are like, "Oh, you changed your mind from your, what you were thinking 5 years ago." Like, yeah, that's it's called evolution.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
All right.
Okay.
let me let you know we've got, I guess, about 25-30 minutes left. We're probably going to go a little bit over just because I've got a bunch of questions here from people and already, and I'm going to let you guys know that it's question time. If you have a question for Anthony, go ahead and put it in the chat box. I'm going to open the phone lines up here in just a little bit, probably another 10 minutes, because I want to get some of these questions out of the way that we had from the earlier show that we had today. All right. So Brian wants to know, when it comes to DMT, I recall that you intend to ask about the machine elves. I was also curious if you could ask Anthony if he knows about other entities people have mentioned under DMT, such as the Dark Jester or the Blue Healing Lady.
I've heard about the Dark Jester, but the Blue Healing Lady I haven't. And that I'd be interested to know more about that. As a very quick aside here, I'm working closely with a couple of guys who are involved in a research project at the moment at Imperial College in London, where under controlled conditions, they're taking DMT and reporting back the entity encounters. And there's some interesting data that's coming through at the moment in terms of this. And again, it seems that the entities are independent of us. But the Blue Lady sounds quite fascinating, particularly because I have an interest in the way in which, under certain circumstances, there seems to be a shift towards the blue end of the spectrum under certain circumstances within the perceptual field. So thank you for that.
All right. And he also wants to know if you have any interest in extraterrestrials if you could expand on your knowledge or any experiences you may have had.
Extensive. One of the areas, again, the discussion that I had with Steve Merrill yesterday, where we were discussing the role of extraterrestrials, because Steve and I are both of the opinion that they're not extraterrestrials, they're intraterrestrials, in that they have been with us, they are part of us, they are part of this planet, they're part of this social system, and they will do whatever it needs to fill in with what our expectations of science are. For instance, I've used the example in the past of the 1890s flap, where the extraterrestrials, in raised commas, were men coming down from airships in the mid-states in America. And when they encountered with people, they spoke with German accents and were human. Then we moved through, and every time the extraterrestrials seemed to morph. They then became the Nordics, and then we had the Greys. It seems to be that they reflect whatever we anticipate they are going to be, which means to me that there's a direct one-to-one relationship between us and them. And I think they are the same as the beings I was talking about before, tulpas, mind forms, thought forms, that are using us in some way, is my opinion. But yes, I've written extensively about extraterrestrials, and I've been involved in the UFO world since the mid-1960s. And indeed, one of the people that is really fascinated by my work is Whitley Strieber and the implications of my work.
All right. And I appreciate you getting through the questions quickly here. Mary Kay wants to know, does Anthony think there is a difference between the soul and consciousness?
Very good point here as to what we mean by consciousness. If we mean consciousness as in eidolonic consciousness, that is consciousness, everyday consciousness that lives in linear time, yes, there is, because soul is the daemon. So soul is the immortal part of us that is outside of the instantation. But it's just terminology. It's just terminology. We are dual beings. Effectively, we are dual beings. We're a daemon and an eidolon. I call it the daemon-eidolon dyad. But as I said, on top of that, there is then the broader consciousness of humanity and all life. And then there's the greater consciousness of what I would call the totality of consciousness, or the go-daemon.
All right. You were talking about black holes in the last time we talked. I didn't write down the person who asked, so I apologize, but I'm sure they're going to be listening to this. They sent me questions because they're asleep right now. So he says a black hole bends light around its event horizon, so you see light coming from behind it. Why does it look round?
Because the light is coming. Whenever the most perfect, if anything expands outwards consistently, it will create a sphere. And a sphere, when it's looked straight on, is round. So when the light is bent around the event horizon, that's why it gives the impression of being a sphere. It's simple as that, because, you think about it, if something just expands outwards in all directions at the same time, it can only ever be a sphere. That's all it can be, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So it actually is round then?
A black hole will be round. But it's an interesting point that I've never thought of before. Is a black hole spherical, or literally a flat disk? And I genuinely don't know. It's a great question, and something I'll look into. Yeah. But in terms of the life bending round, yes, it's gravitational lensing is the technical term for it.
Yeah, I get some good ones. I really do. What do you think of Crowley and the Golden Dawn?
Crowley fascinates me. Yes, he was a showman. Of course he was, as were the elements of the Golden Dawn as well, McGregor Mathers and everybody else. And I've written extensively in the past about these guys. But Crowley, I'm intrigued by Crowley's entity called AWAS, because if you look at AWAS, which was an entity I think he claimed he created as a thought form somewhere in about 1910, something like this, it looks like a grey. It doesn't have the big eyes, but its chin, the shape of its chin and everything is very reminiscent of the classic greys. Again, I would argue that these are tulpa thought forms. And of course, this is exactly what Crowley was doing. He was trying to create servitors. He was trying to create through Enochian magic. And again, we don't have time to talk about the Book of Enoch, which is one of the non-Gospels of the Judeo-Christian Bible. But in the Book of Enoch, it discusses about what I would call Aggregorials.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Is there anything in the Bible or in the books of the Bible that have been removed that would suggest that we relive our lives again and again? Hang on a second, Vash.
Yes, there are. Again, in my first book, I have a section on this, that the people who were very interested in this whole idea of living your life again were the Gnostics, were quite fascinated by the whole idea, and the Stoics were particularly interested by this. And in my first book, I have a section from 2 or 3 sections from Gnostic Gospels. These are Gospels that didn't make it into the final version of the Bible, that describe time stopping, that describe the circularity of time, and quotations about the Daemon and the way in which we live our lives again. So yes, and again, if you get hold of my first book, you'll find a section on there which discusses in great detail the background to Gnostic beliefs and how Gnostic beliefs mirror a great deal of my own ideas. And of course, Gnostics were a schismatic Christian sect in the 1st, 2nd century AD, which then became the Cathari and the Bogomils, and morphed into some very interesting groups over the years.
All right. Caller, I believe it's Vash is on the phone from Australia. Vash, how you doing? You're on Conflict Radio.
Indeed I am. It feels a bit weird speaking to you now that it's nighttime here.
It's morning here.
It's morning here too. It's really early here.
Yeah, I spoke in Australia a few years ago, and I found it quite strange. It's the whole feeling of where you are. But
it's all right. You've become one of the nighttime people now. There's no going back.
Oh, hell, we'll see. You got a question for Anthony, Vash?
Well, yeah, I actually kind of do, and also maybe even some just a thought. So something I thought about quite a little while back, and it's interesting that even technically within our social structures and also societies as a whole, we technically are experiencing the same world at the same time, but have a completely different perception. And a really great example that I could think about was we have lost tribes out there. So their perception of the world in terms of what it is and the way they interpret it is currently still, they're still living very primitive technology-based life and all that sort of stuff. And the comprehension of everything that's around them, they don't even see it, understand it, even know about it for that matter. And then you then go to the next step, which would be maybe people that would be living like, for example, in North Korea. People in North Korea might be aware of primitive life and how stuff went on, but they will look back and they will look at those people and go, they were living a very primitive sort of based, simple life. And then we now can look at North Korea and we can do the exact same thing to them. So makes me, in a way, kind of wonder as well at the same time, who else is here, how are they perceiving us, and what do we not know about? I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Exactly. There's a paradox within scientific thought, and I can't remember the name of it now, but there's something paradox. It will come to me maybe. And it's the idea that every single civilization and every single technological civilization and scientific civilization of whatever level always believes that it's the ultimate in terms of understanding of the universe and how it works. So the idea is that the chances of any one civilization science having sussed it is highly unlikely, because we've only been around for, 1 million years, less than that in terms of Homo sapiens. So clearly we think we are advanced. But of course, advanced is a very curious term. What does it really mean? One would argue the indigenous peoples of Australia live far more in tune with the universe around them. But more importantly, there is a concept called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which suggests that societies, the way certain societies, and indeed all societies, perceive the world is dependent upon both their language, and their technology and their anticipations of that universe. So it is almost as if the world you perceive is, again, using my term, egregorial, in that, for example, one of the examples I use in this is the sun spinning in the sky at Fatima in 1917 in Portugal. Now, there were people who witnessed that event where the sun spun in the sky and came down towards the earth. Now, we know that astronomically that is impossible, but people saw it. And people who saw it weren't necessarily religious believers. Some of them were agnostics and and atheists, and some believers saw it. But it seems that they were all anticipating this happening. And it's again the idea that, for instance, I'm always intrigued as to why it is that I'm not religious. I don't have a religious bone in my body, but there are friends of mine and people I know who see everywhere evidence of their religious belief system. And it's almost as if their social world is created by their belief system, and everything they perceive then reinforces that belief in one way or another. And could it be this is what we do? You know, when we're in a particular civilization, we all collectively accept the status quo, and therefore that's what it becomes. So that's a very, very interesting point. And one, you know, as you know, as my background as a sociologist has always intrigued me. You know, how do we all conform in the way we do, in effect? You know, and it's a very good question. So thank you for that, Baz. Very interesting. Whereabouts in Australia are you?
I'm calling from Melbourne.
Oh, right, great city. I spoke in Melbourne 6 years ago. I was up in Doncaster East. Is it down by the big shopping centre?
Well, all I can say is I know where that is, and I also know it's not exceptionally far from where I am.
Wonderful, great. I can visualise where you are then.
Roughly. Oh, to just quickly touching base on that previous question about the black hole. So it is to my understanding that when a star dies, it basically pretty much implodes in itself, and all the matter is pretty much compressed. So some people believe this is potentially a black hole or the makings of. So I'd be led to believe it's spherical, and the light that you see that's around it or creating that is the bending of light through the means of gravity. So the light that's actually coming from behind and around it, and it's just bending it as it's actually coming into the black hole. So that's why you see it.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, of course, because a black hole is something that the escape velocity is greater than the speed of light. So effectively, no light can escape from it because it is so dense. Because, of course, we know that the denser an object, the greater the gravitational field around it. And, of course, then it will bend light around it. And this is one of the things we were discussing yesterday, because one of the things that these researchers have discovered is that when these entities are around, one of the things they find is that the actual fields, they create gravitational wells. And these gravitational wells bend light. And in the next show, which will be at the end of the beginning of January, I've asked for evidence from the researcher, and he's going to bring some stuff in to show us evidence of this. So these could be even micro black holes being created, which is very, very, very intriguing.
Well, didn't CERN say that they were creating micro black holes?
Well, there's been an argument for a long time that micro black holes are everywhere, and that the background of space and maybe the 0 point field are micro black holes. And again, in one of my books, I discussed the concept of micro black holes in terms of the brain, because this again could be evidence of something that is known as the orchestrated objective reduction, which is the idea that thoughts and consciousness are created via quantum effects. And again, if anybody's interested, check out the work of a guy called Stuart Hamerhoff and Roger Penrose. Both these guys, the OR hypothesis is very, very interesting. Again, suggestive of the fact there's a linkage between quantum behaviors, particularly within the microtubules within the neurons of the brain, and consciousness. Very, very intriguing stuff.
All right, Vash, thanks so much for calling in, man.
Thanks, Vash.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, and hopefully you'll come back to the show, because I know that we could probably spend quite a few hours with questions alone.
I know. So I'm like, we've got 10 minutes left. It's like,
Thanks very much, guys. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
All right, man.
Cheers.
All right, that was Sapphire Elf. We got a missed call from or that was Vash. We got a missed call from Sapphire Elf, so I'm going to try to get him back on right now. Let me ask you. I don't know how I can mute that. There we go.
Hello.
Hey, Sapphire, how you doing, man? Vash beat you to it.
Yep, no worries. Just put you on headset.
You had
So now.
Yeah, sounds good, man. You had a really good question for Anthony in chat, and I told you to go ahead and call in. You call into the show a lot, so I've got you programmed into Skype. What was the question, man? Do you remember?
We had a guest on a while ago that mentioned the concept that if there are parallel universes or other realities, that by simply observing them, they would cease to be parallel because you've interacted with them. I just wondered what his thoughts are on that.
Well, that's an interesting point because, of course, when we use the term parallel universes, we really have to decide what we're talking about here. Now, are we talking about parallel universes that exist within another dimension of space-time, like a parallel universe that exists within the fifth or sixth dimension? Or are we talking about parallel universes in the way quantum physicists see parallel universes? And of course, there's two different types here. There's the parallel universes that come out of the concept of Everett's many worlds interpretation. And of course, Hugh Everett III in his 1957 PhD thesis for John Wheeler argued that you could explain the implications of Schrodinger's cat by saying that the wave function never collapses, and in doing so creates a parallel universe every time. But once the parallel universes have split, as far as we understand them to be, they become totally independent of each other. So there is no possible way of a communication physiologically between one parallel universe and another. But the counter argument to this is that we're talking here about three-dimensional space-time. But consciousness doesn't exist within three-dimensional space-time in the same way that my pen does. So therefore, consciousness might be able to communicate in one way or another. But then the problem would be that you would be communicating with a universe that you're not supposed to be in, if that makes sense, which would cause all kinds of logical problems, if nothing else. Now, the other article, perception of multiple universes, is the idea that if you travel far enough in space-time, and if space is infinite, there will be a point where time rolls back on itself. These are called Poincaré's recurrence, I think it's called. And although these are huge amounts of timescales, these different universes, but that again exist within different times. But I think parallel universes, I think we need to think far more about them and what they mean, because I sometimes feel that our minds aren't programmed to be able to think about these things because we are limited by our own brain power. And these things are so counterintuitive. As somebody said, as Richard Feynman once said in terms of quantum physics, we don't know why this is the way it is. Don't ever try to think why it is this way, because by going down that path, you'll just drive yourself crazy. It just is. And this is the only way forward, I think. But that's an excellent question. Thank you.
Yeah, I like the way you explained it. I thought you'd have some good info to share with that.
Well, it was definitely a good point, Sapphire. I forget what guest we were talking to when that came up, but man, that was fascinating. I'm gonna let you go, man. Have a good night.
Okay, you too. Yep, great guest, Anthony, too.
Thank you.
All right, Saph. Have a great night, man. All right, let me ask you this, Anthony. Is it possible that parallel universes are really just our main brain that's dying, going through all of these lives we discussed earlier, and maybe catching different glimpses of them?
Yeah, it could be. It could be in that, when you hear reports of what's called a panoramic life review within NDE reports, people turn around. Some people will say they saw their whole life sequentially. Other people will say they saw snapshots and bits of their life. Again, it was interesting in the book, I cite the case of a young lady called Jill Hicks, who was involved in the London bombings on the 7th of July 2005. And she was badly injured inside a train in the London Underground. And as she said, and I can quote her actually, she said, "My life was flashing before my eyes, flickering through every scene, every happy, sad moment, everything I had ever done, said, and experienced." And that when and somebody else said, a hiker, this is fascinating, called Paul Sims, he fell down a 1,000-foot granite face in Yosemite. And as he was falling, he was hit in the face by a tree branch and then past a climber negotiating the cliff face. And he said, as he's falling, his whole life flashed before his eyes. It seemed to go chronologically, but super sped up. And again, it just seems that we get glimpses as if it's already recorded, as if these are recordings. And again, this comes back to the work of an American neurosurgeon who worked in Canada, in Quebec, between the 1930s and 1950s, called Wilder Penfield. And Penfield was able to, by placing an electrode onto the exposed brain of conscious patients, was able to stimulate past life memories in 3 dimensions. The people were literally back reliving an element of their past. And Penfield, towards the end of his life, suggested that the human brain records every single experience you have, and it's recorded holographically within the brain. So each life that we have, we record. So it's as if we live multiple lives, but each one of them is recorded, and they are there to be relived in 3-dimensional linear time, if we wish to do so.
It's fascinating stuff. It really is. Okay, guys, this is your last chance. If you have a question for Anthony Peake, go ahead and put it in the chat box now. I'm going to go ahead and shut the phone lines up. I've got a couple written down from earlier today. And, I found this to be an interesting one, Anthony. What do you think of this? As when it comes to out-of-body experiences, I guess astro traveling and things like that, is it possible for somebody to leave their body and come back into someone else's?
Yes. Again, if you read my book, The Out-of-Body Experience, I wrote a whole book on this. And one of the most fascinating sections in this is the experiences of Robert Munroe. Now, Robert Munroe was the guy that really almost started the out-of-body experience things with his book, Journeys Out of the Body. And as he developed his abilities to travel in out-of-body experiences, he found that on occasions he would inhabit the body of somebody else, which he called I there. And there was one fascinating case that I cited in my book, The Out-of-Body Experience, where Munroe goes to sleep, finds himself inside the body of I there, literally dropped into the body of I there as he's in a business meeting. So I there in this other universe is in a business meeting, and suddenly Robert finds himself in this guy's body, and they're negotiating a business deal. And the guy that he's negotiating the business deal with asks him a question. He doesn't have an answer. And Robert Munroe described the look of I there's wife in this other location, looking at him, wondering what he was trying to say to him. And he used to do this regularly, and he was able to see this alternate world that he went to. Now, again, there's a friend of mine, Samantha Lee Treasure, who she has what she calls future Tokyo. And Sam is she astral travels or has out-of-the-body experiences regularly. And she has what she calls future Tokyo. And she travels around this future Tokyo as somebody else. She gets reflections of this person in shop windows, and it's not her, it's somebody else. And she feels this person's thoughts and hopes and fears. So I'd argue that, what's happening here is that when you go into an out-of-body experience, you transpose from the daemon into the mind of the uber daemon, and then come down into another consciousness. Now, again, if anybody is really interested here, there is a friend of mine called Louis Solorat. And if I'll try and put up on my YouTube on my Facebook page a link to this. Louis has actually done a short film based upon Robert Munroe's ideas of I there. It's really well worth watching. Well worth watching. So it really gives the idea of dislocation that people have in these states. But in long answer to a short question, but yes, I believe you can go into other people's bodies and experience the world from their point of view.
It sounds fascinating. Let me ask you this, a question that somebody sent me in email after we did a rebroadcast. Somebody wants to know, is it possible that consciousness actually can come from our gut bacteria?
Been told this before. No reason why not, because as far as I'm aware, some of the gut, I don't know whether it's gut bacteria or there are neurons within the gut in some way, because we do say, don't we, kind of a gut feeling.
Yeah.
And it could be that if consciousness is a field rather than brain located, there's no reason to assume why it couldn't extend throughout the body in different ways. And we are again being very cerebral-ocentric, to coin a phrase, by assuming that it is just the brain that creates consciousness. It could be much broader than that. If the brain is just a receiver, there's no reason why, for instance, there are neurons in the retina of the eye. The retina at the back of the eye is effectively part of the brain. So there's no reason, I don't think, why not. We need to just start thinking a little bit more broader in the implications of these things. But excellent question.
All right. Hank Stalk wants to know, what's Anthony's vision on the holographic universe principle?
Absolutely into it, completely and utterly. There are a whole section in my new book on the holographic universe principle, and I go into great detail about the work of Juan Maldacana and Jacob Bekenstein, with particular reference to the way in which black holes seem to be in some way responsible for the creation of the hologram. Again, this is quite interesting, the idea that we are living within a two-dimensional holographic projection, and the holographic projections are projected from the inner edge of the expanding universe. And there are tiny Planck squares, each containing one bit of information, projecting this information inwards. I think it's a very, very powerful model. And if it is holographic, of course, we have to then come to the conclusion, what is the mystery of holograms, for instance, is if you take a holographic image and you smash it into parts, you don't end up like images in a jigsaw puzzle. You end up with denuded images of the whole of the hologram, which means that holograms, effectively, the whole contains the part and the part contains the whole, which effectively means that everything, again, going back to non-locality, and the way in which subatomic particles once interface to the same particle, I think this is evidence that the universe is in itself and outside of itself. It is fascinating. And again, I weave in the holographic principle to the new cheating the Ferryman hypothesis.
All right. And here's a question I had from earlier. I think we touched on it a bit already, but it's a good follow-up to what you just said. Are we coexisting in a simulation, or are we actors in yours?
Yeah, again, it's the question, and that is the billion-dollar question. But effectively, if we take the idea that we're one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, yes, we're all actors in our own drama, because we are all of us, and all of us are in it, because we are one entity experiencing itself subjectively. The question of other minds, by the way, is something that has been a great question within philosophy for centuries. And it is the idea that there's no way I can objectively prove that anybody else exists. And although people condemn solipsism and say that it's crazy and there lies insanity, that as it may be, but it is a very, very powerful concept. And I'll guarantee that 99% of people at some stage in their life say, do you know, I've got no actual evidence that anybody else exists other than me.
Do you think we can plan our lives before we come back?
That would be an interesting point. But yes, in effect, we can, because the Daemon already knows. So the Daemon already has a plan. The Daemon knows what it needs to do in your new life. The issue is how well it can communicate with you. And in my book, Opening the Doors of Perception, I present something I call the Huxleyan spectrum. And I argue that some of us, the Daemon cannot communicate very effectively at all. That's neurotypicals, but people who have certain neurological things such as classic migraine, temporal lobe epilepsy, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, savant syndrome, all these individuals, I argue, their doors of perception are open wider, which allows the Daemon to directly communicate with you. And indeed, I have 3 or 4 people around the world who have been communicating with me whose Daemons are active in their life continually. They are continually talking to them. And of course, the classic history example of this was Socrates. Socrates had a Daemon who was immanent in his life at all times and guided him continually. So yes, we can make a choice of what we can do, and our Daemon is doing that all the time. Just like you do when you play a third-person computer game. You know, you play the game once, you get killed, and the next time round you plan how you're going to play the game the next time to avoid the things that happened last time. It's called Groundhog Life. It's like Groundhog Day.
You think if it would have to have some kind of computing power, right? That would eat up time, or I guess eat up memory. So Blue Chicken here makes a big point. He says if a tree falls in the forest and there is nobody there, does it make a noise? I mean, it wouldn't, right? Because
no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Noise, again, this is the old thing, you know, does a tree fall in a forest? And is there anybody there? There's the other variation of that. If a man is alone in a forest, is he still wrong as far as a woman is concerned? Which is an interesting one as well. But going back to it, the idea that sound waves, a tree falls in a forest, and what the crash you hear is sound waves. But sound waves in themselves are not sound. Sound waves, they're just compressions in the air around the tree as moving outwards again in a sphere. All that then happens is those vibrations, those compressions, then hit the eardrum, and that is then converted into an electrical signal, which goes into the brain, which the brain then interprets as the sound of a tree crashing. There is no crashing of a tree. There is no red out there. There is no blue out there. I call this thing electromagnetic chauvinism. The idea that we think that whatever is out there that we see is what is really there. Red is nowhere. There is no color out there.
I mean, if you're walking in a forest, I mean, there's a good chance that forest may not even have existed until you actually started to walk there.
Well, there is the argument, again, if you look at the writings of people like Tom Campbell, and Tom Campbell will argue in his My Big Toe hypothesis, you know, that effectively everything is rendered as you look at it. The computer program, or what we consider to be the program, which clearly is much more sophisticated than we can ever begin to imagine. And again, we haven't even touched upon the creators of the program and why the program is here. And again, I suggest that you check up some of the writings of a number of individuals in this area, because the idea is that it's rendered because you look at it. So for instance, I'm talking to you now looking at my computer, but there is no reason within my world for everything that's behind my head to be rendered at all, because it's not needed to be rendered. It only needs to be rendered when I look at it. And of course, there is then the argument of how does this computer work? Well, it could be something working within the 0 point field. I saw a news item literally today on one of my Facebook feeds that the Chinese quantum computers now are hundreds and hundreds of times more powerful than the Google quantum computer. And of course, you know, quantum computers, get this, if you're not aware of this, quantum computers actually do the calculations in alternate universes. That's how they work.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. Well, I guess I'm going to let you go, but I got to ask you one more question that we ask every guest, and my chat room's blowing up, wondering if I'm even going to ask it. Do you know who Corn Pop is?
Corn Pop?
Yeah.
No.
All right. I guess Corn Pop is a bad dude. I wouldn't imagine you'd waste your time in politics, right?
Not particular. Well, I'm very political, but I don't talk about politics in interviews because I find it divisive. In that, you know, I will not necessarily agree with some other people's politics, and I don't want to fall out.
The only way that I think the Earth is going to get to a more positive outlook is if we all just stop talking about it. Yeah,
and we all start seeing each other as human beings.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
And realizing we're all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. So everything you do and say has an effect on you ultimately, and it comes back to you.
Right, awesome.
And that, I think, is the way I live my life, and I try not to be dismissive of other people's ideas, because everybody's ideas are based upon their life experiences. Nobody just comes up with an idea spontaneously. It's because this is what your life has told you is the facts of life. And when you take that into account, you have to appreciate that we all have a unique worldview.
Yeah.
But we need to share it. We need to work together in some way.
I think everybody just needs to turn off the TV and focus on their local life.
Funnily enough, that is true. And one of the things, can I just make a very quick point here?
Yeah, of course.
While I've got your attention and the guys out there. If anybody is interested in continuing interacting with me, I am doing a 5-hour live question and answer session on Wednesday, the 15th of December. I'll be doing 2 hours in the morning in the UK and 3 hours in the afternoon. It's open access. You can ask me any questions. Just go into the chat box. I'll place something about this on my Facebook wall. It's already up there, but I'll place it up again. Come on, guys, join in, including yourself. Let's continue these conversations. Then we've got 5 hours to really, really dig into these issues, and to get you give me feedback of your ideas as well.
I could talk to you easily for 5 hours. Yeah, post the link, and guys, let me I guess go ahead and tell everybody where else they can find you. I know I got all the links in the description, but that's where I was going to go.
Well, what I could do is I'll put that link in your YouTube chat, can't I? I can put it into there underneath it. Okay, which I will do. Right, if anybody's interested, I'm extremely active on Facebook, phenomenally active on Facebook. I have around about, including followers, around about 11,000 people involved on that at the moment. We are an international community. We chat to each other. We become friends with each other. There are people, there are even marriages that have come off the back of this work. So, it's that important to us. I will try my best to respond if I can, but just please understand, I get scores of emails every day and messages, and sometimes I humanly cannot. It's just me. I don't have a secretary or anything, so it's just me on my own. But I'm very active on there. I post regularly on there. If you just put Anthony Peake, you'll find me. You will find on Facebook also, most of my books also have their own Facebook pages as well. So you link in, just put the book title in on there as well. I'm on Instagram, and I'm regularly on Instagram as Cheat the Ferryman 54. That's Cheat the Ferryman 54. But I'll guarantee if you just put Cheat the Ferryman in there, you'll find me. My YouTube channel is getting more and more popular as more and more people are hearing about it. On there, you will find interviews with a lot of the people I've cited today, such as Art Funkhauser and various other people. Again, I reference my sources, and I give my sources the opportunity to put their viewpoints forward. I do a live in-con every Monday afternoon between 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock UK time, where we have guests and people can listen in and join in on YouTube. That goes out live on YouTube off my YouTube wall. Then every month on the Sunday afternoon, UK time, between 5 to 6, I have the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour, where I have a guest and I interview them. And my next guest is going to be Daniel Pinchbeck, which some of you guys may know is quite a famous writer, American writer. And also on the 13th, I have Dr. Steve Taylor joining me for the Incon. And I do this with a good friend of mine called Sarah James. So there are all the contact points. I have a website, anthonypeake.com. If you want to read my books you can order from any bookshop anywhere in the world. Some of the bookshops will actually have the books there available. If not, you can get my books from your local library or order them from your local library internationally. If you are interested in buying my books directly from me, you can buy them off the website, and I send out signed copies. The problem there is the postage and package is now getting so extortionate, it's not really viable for you to do so. If you want to buy my books on Amazon, they're there. Number of my books, all my books are in Kindle as well as hard copy. Also, 4 of my books are in Audible, 3 of which are me reading them. And this new book, we're planning to bring out an Audible edition as well as a hard copy edition for next year. What else can I tell you? That's really about it at the moment. But just join in. I want as many people involved. And please, guys, help me get these ideas out there. Oh, yes. If anybody is interested in a copy of my Bix essay, the one that they rejected, just message me and I'll send you a PDF.
That's
free
awesome,
PDF.
man.
And send that out to all your contacts, because I want people to know, I want to understand why that essay was rejected by the judges.
All right, everybody, the links are down in the description box below. Go ahead and reach out to Anthony if you want. Anthony, just hang on a second, and let me wrap things up here, and I'll talk to you just for a second off the air. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I know it's not our normal time, but hey, we actually had quite a decent amount of people in here, so maybe we'll do this again sometime, especially with the European guests. maybe, I mean, I actually feel pretty good. So it's not too bad on me and mine here. So maybe we can actually do this again. Remember, you can always find us online. Just go to www.conflictradio.net. You can find us on Apple, iTunes, Spreaker, and all of your normal podcast catchers. We will be back on Thursday at our normal time, not this early morning time, but on our normal time, 7:30 Eastern time. We'll be live on Thursday. Well, until then, everybody, batten down the hatches, of course, and be safe.
See aircraft that were clearly talks about some